The Conjuring, The Haunting in the Shadows. Chapter 1, The Desperate Plea. It was a calm spring evening when the phone rang in the Warren household. Ed and Lorraine had just finished dinner and were relaxing in their living room, reviewing notes from a recent case. They exchanged curious glances when the phone rang. Calls at this late hour usually meant someone was in dire need of help. Lorraine lifted the receiver. "Hello, Warren residence," she spoke softly into the mouthpiece. A female voice, shaky and hollow, answered on the other end. "Oh, thank God. I'm sorry to call so late, but I didn't know who else to turn to," the woman said frantically. She introduced herself as Emma Anderson and proceeded to tell Lorraine about the torment afflicting her family in their home in Rhode Island. As Emma described the increasingly terrifying events, Lorraine beckoned Ed over with a concerned look. Ed leaned in close to listen as Emma recalled the disembodied voices, fleeting shadows, and vague but sinister presence haunting them. "We've tried everything, priests, mediums, you name it. But whatever is in this house, it won't leave us alone," Emma explained, her voice breaking. "My children wake up screaming every night. My husband and I can barely sleep. Please, you have to help us before this evil drives us mad." Lorraine gripped the phone tighter. "Mrs. Anderson, Ed and I will do everything in our power to help your family," she reassured. Emma thanked them profusely before passing the phone to her husband, James, to provide directions to their home in the small town of Ashford, Rhode Island. After assuring the Andersons they would leave first thing in the morning, Lorraine finally hung up the phone with a heavy sigh. A worried expression crossed her usually serene face. "This sounds like a dire situation," Ed said. "That poor family is at the end of their rope." Lorraine nodded grimly as she recalled Emma's unsettling account. "Whatever is haunting them is no residual spirit. It feels calculated and malevolent," she murmured. They both knew this would be no routine haunted house call. Malevolent spirits were intelligent entities hell-bent on causing torment and anguish. Ed and Lorraine had encountered such entities before, but the Andersons were clearly dealing with something exceptionally nefarious and persistent. The next morning, after a restless night's sleep, Ed and Lorraine loaded up their station wagon with the essential equipment for an in-depth paranormal investigation. The drive from their home in Connecticut to Ashford took just over an hour. As Lorraine gazed out the window at the passing scenery, she couldn't shake a strange sense of foreboding that had come over her since Emma's call. Ed reached over and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. Her trepidation did not go unnoticed. Around noon, they pulled up to the Andersons' home on the outskirts of Ashford. It was an imposing Victorian estate, 3 stories high with a wraparound porch and ornate trim. But there was a definite gloominess to the once stately home. The paint was faded and chipped, the gardens overgrown and neglected. As Ed and Lorraine exited the car, the heavy silence rang in their ears. No birds chirping, no wind rustling the trees. The only movement was the curtains in one of the windows swaying back and forth lazily. Too lazily for a simple draft, Lorraine noted with a shiver. Before they could knock, the large front door creaked open slowly. Emma Anderson's weary face peered out at them. Even from the porch, the Warrens could sense the poor woman's frayed nerves. Emma waved them inside with a weak smile. "Thank you again for coming. Things have only gotten worse since I called," she said softly, locking the door behind them. The foyer was just as run down as the exterior. Yet remnants of the home's once fine decor remained: faded wallpaper, dusty crystal chandeliers, ornate crown molding now dotted with cobwebs. As she led them down the hall, Emma paused briefly in front of a painting hanging crookedly on the wall. "I apologize for the state of the house. This haunting has really taken a toll," she remarked with a sad sigh. Before Lorraine could reply, a loud thump sounded from upstairs, causing Emma to gasp sharply. Ed and Lorraine exchanged a serious look. I take it your, housemates are anxious to meet us, Ed said wryly. Emma's eyes filled with tears as she turned and called upstairs for her husband. James Anderson emerged looking just as drained as his wife. He maintained his composure as he shook hands firmly with Ed and Lorraine. We are very grateful to have you both here. Please make yourselves at home, and thank you again for coming on such short notice, James said in a measured tone, though his eyes betrayed his anguish. Over the next few hours, the Warrens interviewed the Andersons extensively. Emma and James recounted the escalating supernatural occurrences, objects moving on their own, strange aromas wafting through the air, disembodied whispers and cries. The activity centered heavily around their 12-year-old daughter's bedroom. The distraught parents described her screaming nightly as objects flew around her room. She's just a child, yet this evil entity torments her the most, Emma said tearfully. James kept an arm around his wife, his jaw tight with frustration. Ed flipped through his notes with a furrowed brow. Folks, I know this is hard, but we need you to be strong. Lorraine and I are going to get to the bottom of this, but you have to keep up hope. Lorraine gave them an encouraging smile. Why don't you try to rest while Ed and I do some preliminary investigating? We'll let you know if we need anything else. Emma nodded gratefully before retiring upstairs with James. Finally alone, the Warrens wasted no time unpacking their equipment and getting to work. As dusk fell outside, the activity in the house began to intensify. The battle for the Andersons' souls was on. Chapter 2, The Enigmatic Victorian House. As Ed and Lorraine began their preliminary investigation, the activity in the house quickly escalated. The temperature dropped sharply, their breath visible in the chilly air. They made their way through the first floor, devices in hand, scrutinizing every room. With practiced expertise, they tested for electromagnetic fluctuations, mysterious cold spots, and attempted to communicate with any restless spirits. Upstairs, floorboards creaked and groaned of their own volition. Muffled voices echoed down the stairwell from unseen sources. Ed glanced up with a look of grim resolve. Whatever was haunting this home was stirring, aware of their presence. Lorraine paused in the parlor, gazing thoughtfully at the 19th-century portraits adorning the walls. She recognized some of the surnames from the founding families of Ashford depicted in the paintings. Generations of Andersons had resided in this home over a century. As Lorraine studied the portraits closely, a strange ringing filled her ears. She swayed slightly, putting her hand on a nearby chair to steady herself. Ed noticed her sudden discomfort. You all right? He asked. She nodded, but he could tell the energy in the house was affecting her. They continued into the study at the back of the house. A lone floor-to-ceiling bookcase dominated the room, crammed with ancient leather-bound tomes. Oddly, a thin layer of dust covered every piece of furniture except one ornate desk. Lorraine ran her hand along the polished mahogany surface. As she inspected the meticulously organized drawers and shelves, she commented, "Seems like everything in this house is decaying and dusty, except this desk. Curious." Ed leafed through some of the books, whistling as he noted their rare occult topics, witchcraft, demonology, and mystical symbols. For now, they decided to leave the suspicious study be and explore the upstairs. With each step up the creaking staircase, the air grew heavier. Lorraine paused briefly on the landing, feeling an unseen presence hovering nearby. As they examined the upstairs bedrooms, they discovered more odd inconsistencies. Rotting wood, peeling wallpaper, heavy cobwebs, except in one room. The daughter, Lucy's, bedroom looked freshly painted and decorated, untouched by the decay pervading the rest of the house. Dolls and stuffed animals lined her shelves, lace curtains framed the windows. It seemed like an ordinary little girl's room, but Lorraine sensed something sinister lurking beneath the innocent facade. Ed eyed the room warily. Well, this certainly sticks out. Guess we know where our ghostly pals are focusing their efforts. Lorraine nodded grimly. She knew they needed to tread carefully here. Night had fallen completely by the time they finished scouring the premises. No obvious clues yet, but a perplexing dichotomy lingered. The accelerating decay contrasted with almost staged areas of preservation. In the parlor once more, Lorraine gazed pensively into the cold fireplace. She remarked, "It's like two forces are at work here. One desires utter destruction, while the other, desperation for things to remain unchanged." Ed jotted notes, impressed by his wife's intuition. Lorraine's insights often provided the missing pieces in their investigations. Before they could discuss further, hurried footsteps descended the stairs. Emma appeared, wringing her hands anxiously. "Oh, thank heavens you're still here. We need help." She led them upstairs to the bedroom of their 16-year-old son Michael. Inside, James sat on the bed holding a baseball bat, staring wildly around the room as objects zoomed by of their own accord. Ed and Lorraine sprang into action. Lorraine entered a trance-like state, attempting to communicate with the entities. Meanwhile, Ed photographed the flying objects, capturing ghostly faces in the images. An hour later, the activity finally settled. The exhausted Andersons thanked the Warrens profusely for stopping the bedlam. As Lorraine comforted the distraught mother, Ed pulled James aside to reassure him. "James, I know how frightening all this is, but we're making progress," Ed said. "Whatever forces are in this house, we're going to get to the bottom of it." James ran a shaky hand through his hair. "It's just so much at once. We've lived here for years, but the last 6 months." His voice caught as tears welled up. "You have to help us end this nightmare." Ed gripped his shoulder. "We will. You have my word." As the Warrens concluded the long first night, more puzzles awaited solving. The escalating supernatural attacks highlighted two opposing objectives. One force cultivated preservation and order, while the other relished fear and decay. Lorraine knew a grueling battle was ahead, but their faith kept them going. She said a silent prayer for the tormented Anderson family. The answers were here, they just had to stay vigilant. With the dawn, Ed and Lorraine hoped light would shed upon the shadows obscuring the truth about this enigmatic house and its haunted inhabitants. Chapter 3, Whispers in the Dark. Sunlight filtering into the parlor roused Ed and Lorraine from a short rest on the lumpy sofas. After a brief breakfast with the Andersons, they resumed their investigation. Emma brought them up to speed on the activity that permeated the rest of the house overnight, more objects flying about, disembodied cries, lights flickering on their own accord. The entities were making their displeasure known. As Ed reviewed his case notes, Lorraine wandered the first floor, tuning her psychic senses to the atmosphere. She paused at the base of the stairs. A faint whisper drifted down from the landing above. Lorraine tilted her head, straining to make out any words, but the hushed voice remained unintelligible. She called Ed over. "You hear that?" Ed stood silent, listening hard past the usual creaks and groans of the old house. As he focused, the faintest whispering reached his ears, a murmuring just out of grasp. Yet he could feel the desperation radiating from that pleading voice. Ed met Lorraine's eyes with a nod. "Someone, or something, is trying to communicate with us." They slowly climbed the stairs, instruments at the ready. The whispers intensified, overlapping in tortured cries. Still, the meaning eluded them. On the landing, Ed snapped several photos while Lorraine recorded the escalating voices on a reel-to-reel tape deck. She felt an icy presence lurking nearby. "Why are you here?" a breathy voice asked, no more than a hushed murmur. Lorraine turned sharply, searching for the source. "We're here to help. This is your home, and we only want the haunting to cease," she implored to the empty air. A plaintive sob echoed down the hall in response. Then, a heavy silence descended, leaving Lorraine's plea unanswered. She looked at Ed, frustrated but determined. Making contact was the first step, now they had to gain the spirit's trust. As the day wore on, the Warrens expanded their exploration room by room. The supernatural encounters never ceased. Footsteps trailed behind them through dusty halls. Shadowy figures darted across doorways. Unseen hands brushed past their faces. Throughout the endless approach and quick retreat of the entities, the whispers persisted. Late afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the upper floor rooms. Lorraine entered Lucy's darkened bedroom alone. She took a seat in the center, eyes closed. A deep sense of sadness washed over her. Words began to form amidst the lingering whispers. Protect her, keep her safe. Lorraine nodded, speaking gently. You care deeply for this family. We only want to help, but you need to stop frightening them. A tense silence followed. Then, a reply echoed from the darkest corner. Asterisk others don't share my aims. You should not be here, asterisk the last words lingered as a warning. Before Lorraine could probe further, footsteps approached down the hall. Ed entered, his expression turning solemn as he sensed the heavy atmosphere. Lorraine shook her head, they weren't going to get more answers here right now. Night gradually fell again. Ed and Lorraine gathered with the Andersons to go over the day's findings and experiences. They sugar-coated nothing, laying out the intense supernatural forces dwelling alongside the family. Somber and weary, Emma just kept repeating, "Why us? Why our home?" No one had an answer. Not yet. Later, Lorraine helped tuck young Lucy into bed, praying this would be a peaceful night for her. Leaving the nightlight on, she joined Ed in their makeshift base in the parlor. They had a late dinner as Ed developed the day's photographs. One image in particular drew his attention, a shadowy form hovering behind Emma in the upstairs hall. He pointed it out to Lorraine. They both shuddered as they made out the rotted, contorted face peering over Emma's shoulder. The image perfectly captured the entity's silent but sinister threat. As the old house groaned and settled around them, the Warrens rested on the lumpy sofas, knowing sleep would be hard to come by. The whispered words of warning lingered in Lorraine's mind. You should not be here, she sighed, grasping Ed's hand. Wherever evil lurked, so would they. Chapter 4, Uncovering the Past. Morning dawned after another restless night for the inhabitants of the troubled Victorian home. Ed woke feeling drained, the influence of the malevolent entities taking its toll. Lorraine stirred next to him, her face drawn. We need to dig deeper into this property's history today, she said firmly. I know the answers we seek are there. Ed nodded. I'll ask James to put us in touch with their local historian. Maybe he can shed light on this town's hidden past. Over a quick breakfast, Ed conferred with James while Lorraine checked in on young Lucy. The girl seemed paler than before, dark circles under her eyes. Lorraine's heart ached to see her living in constant fear. James agreed to call the historian, an older gentleman named Theodore Clark, to come speak with the Warrens. His family had lived in Ashford for generations and knew its history inside and out. Lorraine felt a spark of hope hearing this. Late morning, Mr. Clark arrived at the house. He was taken aback by the supernatural occurrences the family described. Despite living in Ashford his whole life, he had no inkling of the property's haunted reputation. My dear friends, I am appalled you have had to endure this, Mr. Clark said. Let me tell you all I know about our town and its founders. Settling into the parlor with Lorraine and Ed, Mr. Clark revealed Ashford's past. The town was settled in 1692 by a small group of Puritans from Massachusetts looking to establish a pious, isolated community. According to legend, one of the founders, Isaiah Hunt, made a pact with dark forces to ensure Ashford's success and his own prosperity. This pact permitted an ancient evil to stake its claim on the settlement. Over the generations, Ashford residents experienced mysteriously failed crops, illness, and unexplained deaths. For centuries, the true darkness at the town's core remained concealed. Ed and Lorraine exchanged uneasy looks as Mr. Clark spoke. The tale was eerily reminiscent of what they had observed in the house, an insidious darkness intertwined with attempts to maintain normalcy. When Mr. Clark finished the grim history, Lorraine had many questions. "What do you know of witches or occult practices in Old Ashford?" she asked. Mr. Clark frowned. "Ah yes, the witch trials. Well, in Ashford's early days, hysteria certainly took hold. Several women were accused of witchcraft over the decades. Most were spared, but one woman, Martha Bishop, was tragically executed in 1715. Executed? Ed asked sharply. You mean, she was put to death? The old historian sighed. I'm afraid so. Accused of hexing a prominent family's son with an incurable illness. Martha maintained her innocence but was hanged before she could get a fair trial. A heavy silence followed as they absorbed this revelation. Lorraine gripped Ed's arm. Her intuition screamed that this was a critical piece of the puzzle. Ed reflected her certainty. That poor woman's spirit just might still be with us today. Mr. Clark's visit provided vital background to inform their investigation. The Warrens now strongly suspected the entities tormenting the Andersons were connected to Ashford's founders and their ill-fated bargain with malevolent forces. They needed more details on Martha Bishop's unjust end if they hoped to appease her restless soul. After Mr. Clark departed, Ed and Lorraine decided to pay a visit to Ashford's Historical Society to dig deeper into Martha's story. The mentions of witches, pacts with darkness, and a wrongful execution were all pieces of a puzzle begging to be solved. At the archives, dusty town records corroborated Martha's tragic fate. She was widowed young when her husband died of tuberculosis, leaving her a social outcast as an unwed woman. The accusations of witchcraft seemed unfounded, spawned by petty town gossip. Her execution had been swift and without appeal. Lorraine shook her head sadly as she sifted through the records. An innocent life cut short due to ignorance and hysteria. Her only crime was being an unmarried woman with herbs and remedies. We have to make this right somehow. Ed agreed. They were now dealing with an unrestful spirit longing for justice centuries overdue. Back at the house, they had to find a way to free Martha from her torment and protect the living residents from further harm. Night was falling as they headed back. The answers were coming into focus, but avenues for resolution remained unclear. Lorraine prayed their faith would guide the way against the ancient evil still lurking within Ashford's shadows. Chapter 5: Gathering Allies. Exhausted after a long day of research, Ed and Lorraine knew they needed help. The magnitude of this haunting and its connection to Ashford's history meant they couldn't handle it alone. The next morning, they asked the Andersons to reach out to trusted members of the community who could aid the investigation. First on their list was Father Michael, the local Catholic priest. His experience assisting families with aggressive hauntings could provide spiritual guidance. Emma called him right away, moved to tears when he readily agreed to visit that same day. Father Michael arrived by noon, his presence bringing a calming influence over the house. He said a blessing in each room, sprinkling holy water as he went. The restless spirits seemed to retreat from his prayers and crosses, if only temporarily. Your faith is strong, Father Michael said to Ed and Lorraine. But the forces plaguing this home require more than religious rites to banish them. He suggested they call on Ida Walker, a renowned psychic and medium in the next town over. With her ability to communicate directly with spirits, she could prove invaluable. The Andersons knew Ida by reputation and called her at once. Later that day, Ida arrived, her gentle yet confident aura setting Lorraine at ease. This warm, grandmotherly woman embraced her psychic gifts. Ida could help them establish contact and trust with Martha's spirit. Ida walked slowly through the home, quietly absorbing the energy. Upstairs in Lucy's room, she smiled sadly. She lingers here, trying desperately to ease the child's fears. Downstairs in the study, she shivered. But a darker presence guards this room. We must be careful. With Ida and Father Michael's insights, Lorraine felt they finally had the support needed to make progress. That night, they gathered everyone in the parlor so Ida could attempt to reach Martha. The Andersons watched anxiously as she entered a trance state. Ida's voice took on an ethereal, lilting quality as she opened the doorway to the spirit realm. Martha, we call to you with caring hearts. Speak to us, make us understand your pain and fear. A chill wind rushed through the room, extinguishing the candles. Ida remained calm and kept beckoning gently to Martha. For several long minutes, silence. Then, the faintest whisper. Sister. The word echoed softly through the room. Tears sprang to Lorraine's eyes. Ida had established a tentative connection. She pressed on. Yes, sister, I am here. We only wish to help you find peace. Please, speak to us when you feel our warmth. Ida came out of the trance exhausted but smiling. It is a start. She is wary, but I know Martha will communicate when the time is right. Lorraine and Ed felt renewed hope. Even this brief contact was progress. In the days that followed, Ida's reassuring presence and Father Michael's blessings helped temper the dark forces oppressing the home. Ida spent hours in the parlor, softly calling to Martha until her whispers strengthened to almost audible words. But the dark entity lurked, resisting their efforts. Late one evening, after the Andersons had retired, a frantic pounding sounded from deep within the house. Ed and Lorraine rushed to investigate. The pounding came from inside the study. Ed threw his shoulder against the locked door until it burst open. Inside, they were horrified to see Ida floating high above the desk, clutching at her throat. Eyes bulging, face white with terror, she gasped for breath against some unseen stranglehold. Ed shouted and rushed to grab her legs. Lorraine called on divine power to banish this evil spirit. Ida collapsed into Ed's arms, shaking and sobbing. The message from the dark entity was clear: leave this house or deadly peril awaited. Chapter 6: A Glimpse into the Past. The Warrens refused to be deterred by the dark spirit's ominous warning. The next morning, they held a meeting with their allies to review what they knew so far and determine the best path forward. Father Michael advised approaching this situation first and foremost with compassion. Poor Martha lost her life in a climate of fear and hysteria. We must appeal to her humanity. Ida agreed. I will keep working to gain Martha's trust. She must know we intend to help, not harm her. Lorraine suggested Ida attempt another seance, this time focusing solely on connecting with Martha's spirit. Ed could document any paranormal activity, while Father Michael observed for any dangerous entities trying to interfere. That evening, Ed set up cameras and equipment while Ida prepared herself mentally. Father Michael blessed the room and burned sage to cleanse it. The Andersons waited anxiously in the hallway, hoping for breakthroughs. Ida entered a deep trance state and called out gently to Martha. Dear sister, speak to me. Help me understand your story. Shed light on the injustice done to you. Minutes passed in tense silence. Then, voices began whispering, growing louder, overlapping. A gale swept through the room, blowing out the candles and rattling the windows. Ida remained steady, still pleading with Martha. The whispers coalesced into a single female voice, ethereal and mournful. Lorraine recognized it as the same voice she had heard on the stairs that first day. I tried to help her. Ease her pain. They accused me of cursing the child. Martha's voice echoed. Lorraine leaned forward intently. Who did you try to help, Martha? Magdalena. My neighbor. Her child fell ill, and my herbs could not save him. Martha's voice was heavy with sorrow. They blamed me. Took my life as payment. The wind intensified, and Ed shouted as objects flew around the room. But Ida maintained the connection. Your death was unjust, sister. How can we help set you free? The tables suddenly levitated, flipping upside down. A ghostly figure appeared, a young woman bound at the wrists, a noose around her neck. Lorraine gasped as the anguished woman vanished. Ida emerged from her trance, shaken. Father Michael hurried to steady her as Ed grabbed his camera, hoping to have captured the apparition. The Andersons peered in, faces white with shock. That was her, Ida said softly. That was Martha. Emotion filled her voice. Ed quickly developed the photos. On one, they all gasped to see the ghostly figure exactly as Ida described, Martha at the moment of her wrongful death. James Anderson spoke first. That poor woman. If we had known our home harbored such injustice. Emma covered her mouth, tears in her eyes. Father Michael sighed heavily. The sins of the past cast long shadows. We must bring this truth to light for Martha's spirit to find reprieve. Ed put a supportive hand on his shoulder. And we will, Father. Turning to the others, he said resolutely, now we know Martha's story. She deserves justice. We need to continue helping her find peace, and end this curse on the Andersons. Everyone nodded solemnly in agreement. Lorraine squeezed Ed's hand, feeling his steadfast devotion to their cause washing away her self-doubt. With Martha's tragic story illuminated, they had new direction. Her connection to the Andersons' ancestors explained her tortured presence lingering for centuries. Though the reasons were now clear, laying Martha's spirit to rest seemed an almost impossible feat. Lorraine prayed silently for guidance. Freeing Martha required banishing the ancient evil still clinging to Ashford's legacy. She hoped shining light on Martha's unjust fate was the first step toward the town reckoning with its dark past. Much work remained, but she clung to her faith that Martha could finally rest in peace. Chapter 7: Unrelenting Malevolence. Gaining insight into Martha's plight energized Ed and Lorraine. They now understood her anguish over failing to protect Magdalena's child centuries ago. Her lingering guilt kept her spirit trapped. They hoped revealing her story would temper the supernatural attacks on the Andersons. But the activity only grew more sinister. The phantom voices no longer pleaded for help. A menacing presence now stalked the family, subjecting them to horrific visions and bruising assaults. Dark entreaties echoed, urging them to take their own lives. Ed awoke one night to find Lorraine screaming, attacking invisible hands choking her. He turned on the lights, nothing was there, yet she still tore desperately at her throat. When she finally came to, Lorraine wept that a demonic face had appeared inches from hers, threatening to take her soul. They realized the malevolent spirit was targeting them specifically, enraged by their efforts with Martha. But they refused to leave the family defenseless against such evil. One morning, Emma didn't come down for breakfast. James rushed upstairs to check on her and screamed for Lorraine and Ed. They arrived to find Emma cowering in a corner, clawing at her arms raked with bleeding scratches. James shook with rage and despair. No more. I want this devil out of my home. Ed tried calming him while Lorraine helped Emma wash and bandage her wounds, whispering prayers over her. Father Michael came to perform a blessing. As his prayers filled the house, a sound like a hissing wild animal erupted. The priest's eyes widened in alarm before he regained composure and persisted in the blessing ritual. Ida arrived soon after and went immediately to sit with Lorraine. Her expression was grave. You two are in danger, she said bluntly. This spirit means you harm. Lorraine sighed wearily. I know. But we can't abandon them. Ida squeezed her hand, nodding solemnly. Their path was clear, even if perilous. That night, Ed and Lorraine prepared for a long and difficult battle ahead. If the entity was powerful enough to resist a priest's blessings, dispelling it would require their full faith and courage. Lorraine settled in the parlor, praying silently until she slipped into a trance state. On the other plane, she confronted the evil spirit directly. You have no claim to these souls. Only light dwells here now. The dark figure roared, shrieking threats until Lorraine cast it out with divine light. It fled howling into the ether, but they all knew it would be back. Ed soon joined Lorraine, putting a comforting arm around her shoulders. You showed that beast our strength. We're on the right path. Pride and love swelled in Lorraine's heart. In the midnight hours, as the family finally slept, the battle waged on silently. The Warrens patrolled the house room by room, purging malevolent shadows from every corner. When exhaustion overcame them, they collapsed on the parlor sofas, resting fitfully until dawn's light. The entity continued its attacks, but they were weakened now against Ed and Lorraine's spiritual shields around the home. Still, Emma and Lucy bore the brunt of the abuse with bruises and violent dreams. James reached a breaking point days later when the entity nearly pushed Emma down the stairs. Leave us be, curse you, he yelled to the empty air. Turning to Ed and Lorraine, he made a difficult request, you two should go. It's only getting more enraged. Ed sympathized but said firmly, James, you know we won't abandon you. All we've endured only proves we're close. With Ida and Father Michael's help, they slowly gained ground each day. But Lorraine never forgot they faced an ancient evil fueled by a pact with sinister forces. True victory would require unraveling that curse at its roots. For now, their faith was shield and sword against the darkness threatening all who dwelled in the house. Chapter 8, The Gathering Storm. A week passed with no respite from the aggressive haunting. The Andersons oscillated between despondency and rage, helpless against the invisible tormentor. Ed and Lorraine were at their limit physically, but spiritually remained resolute. Late one evening after the house settled down, they convened with Ida and Father Michael. Lorraine outlined what they knew: this entity was no mere ghost. It possessed fiendish intelligence and used fear as a weapon. The history of Ashford's founders implicated something much darker. There is old magic embedded in this land, Ida said gravely. I fear a demonic pact has fed this evil for centuries. Lorraine nodded in agreement. So how do we break this curse? Ed asked. We have to strike at the source. Father Michael spoke solemnly. Prayer and faith can only protect you so far against a demonic force. You must find where it draws its strength and sever that connection. Lorraine knew the priest was right. This required more than comforting Martha's spirit. They had to unravel the sinister roots, negativity and despair emanating from centuries of suffering. Ida suggested a radical idea: hold a séance within the house to directly engage the demonic entity. Once it manifested, they could condemn it back to hell through joint exorcism. Lorraine and Ed weighed the proposal carefully. The risks were immense, but so was the potential reward. The five of them decided to hold the seance the following night when the household was asleep. Ed was wary of failure, but Lorraine reassured him. Our faith and love are stronger than any evil, my love. We must believe that. Late that night, they gathered in the parlor. Ida entered a deep trance and opened the door to the spirit world. As she called into the void, the temperature rapidly dropped. An unholy presence saturated the room, enraged by this intrusion. Demons of deceit, you hold no power here. Evil shall not prevail. Ida proclaimed loudly. The walls shook violently as the demon roared. Objects flew across the room, barely missing them. The battle was underway. Father Michael held up his cross. Leave this place, spawn of Satan. You are cast out by the divine. As they rebuked the demonic forces, the entity materialized before them, a hulking, horned figure wreathed in shadow. Ida's eyes flew open in shock, but she did not break the seance connection. Ed grabbed his camera, documenting the horrific vision while shouting admonishments. Father Michael prayed feverishly, flinging holy water at the snarling beast. It screeched and dissolved into smoke momentarily before taking shape again. Lorraine realized this cursed evil could not exist freely in their mortal realm. Its power was tied to the land itself through some ancient ritual or bargain. They had to break that pact. Ida channeled her mental energy like a laser. Vile trickster, release your hold on this home. The demon thing staggered back, rattling the windows violently. The light commands you, demon. You are banished. Father Michael boomed. Lorraine focused her psychic senses, visualizing the entity fading away like fog in sunlight. With a final shriek, it imploded into a gust of dust, leaving the air dead and still. The only sound was their own labored breathing. Lorraine knew the demon was weakened but not destroyed. The source of its power still remained. As dawn's light crept in, the weary group found renewed conviction. This evil could be conquered through faith and righteousness. By revealing the darkness, they hoped Martha's spirit could finally be freed. Chapter 9, A Confrontation with Darkness. A heavy silence hung over the house in the days following the intense seance. The demonic entity seemed weakened, its attacks fewer and less forceful. But an ominous tension lingered. Ed and Lorraine knew the confrontation with evil was not over. Its source of power ran too deep in Ashford's legacy of fear and superstition. Destroying the demon once and for all meant unraveling centuries of sinister pacts and injustice. Late one night, Ed jolted awake to find Lorraine in a trance state, levitating several feet above the bed. She appeared immersed in a vision, whispering too low to make out. As Ed carefully pulled her back down, shouting her name, Lorraine awoke with a gasp. She grasped Ed's arms, eyes wide. The witch trials. The common ground. That's where it all began. Lorraine explained her vivid vision. Townspeople gathered around a large oak tree, condemning Martha to death before the hanging. The demon presided over it all, feeding on fear and lies. Ed agreed they needed to investigate the old common ground where executions took place in colonial Ashford. There they hoped to unearth clues about the founding pact with darkness dooming Martha and generations more. At sunrise, they ventured into town guided by old maps and Mr. Clark's ancestral knowledge of Ashford. On the edge of the common green, the ancient oak still stood. Twisted and gnarled, it exuded a sinister energy. As they examined the tree, Lorraine's throat constricted with psychic impressions. She saw past victims' faces flickering on the bark, heard echoes of their screams. This tree bore witness to unimaginable suffering and injustice. Lorraine placed a hand on its trunk and began praying softly for salvation, while Ed walked the perimeter. He called Lorraine over to a disturbed area of dirt near the wide roots. Together, they carefully dug until striking something hard. Brushing away the soil revealed a weathered wooden box nestled in the roots. Ed gingerly lifted it out. The clasps were etched with ancient symbols. "This must be the relic binding the demon," he said. "We need to dismantle it properly." Lorraine agreed, but said they would need Ida and Father Michael's help weakening the evil through prayer first. At nightfall, they gathered with Ida and Father Michael in the old common. Under the twisted oak, Ida opened her mind and spirit to confront the demon. As she broadcast love and redemption, Ed began prying open the box's lid. An icy blast lashed them as the box creaked open. The demon materialized before the oak, howling furiously at being unveiled. Father Michael held up his cross as Ida continued appealing to its humanity. "You peddle in lies and falsehoods, demon. We condemn you back to darkness eternal," Ida commanded, eyes blazing. The demon shrieked, thrashing violently. As it dissolved into smoke, Lorraine glimpsed the shadowy faces of its victims swirling within. Ed emptied the contents of the box, ancient coins, bones, and desiccated herbs, and began smashing them under his heel. The demon fought back, hurling debris, but Lorraine visualized divine light enveloping them all. With one final unearthly wail, the demon imploded in a rush of wind. The remains of the box caught flame, the fire racing up the oak until it burned from within, centuries of evil turning to ash. They clung to each other as the flames lit up the night. When the smoke cleared, only charred remains of the tree and box were left. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, leaving only a peaceful stillness behind. Back at the house, the Andersons wept with joy and relief to hear the haunting was over. Lorraine knew Martha could finally rest, her story redeemed from history's shadows. Ashford was forever changed, purified by truth and faith. As she and Ed walked the grounds the next day, she heard Martha's voice on the wind, "Thank you, sister." Lorraine smiled through joyful tears, seeing a ghostly figure standing in the garden bathed in light before vanishing for good. Their work was done. Chapter 10, Banishing the Evil. A week after the fateful night in the old common, life in the Anderson home transformed completely. The oppressive cloud had lifted, allowing warmth and light to return. Ed and Lorraine finally relaxed, knowing the haunting evils were dispelled for good. James embraced Ed tearfully. "I can't thank you enough. You've given us back our lives." Emma hugged Lorraine, both women overwhelmed with gratitude and relief. "This wasn't just our victory," Lorraine said. "It took all of us coming together in faith and compassion." Father Michael and Ida just smiled humbly, while young Lucy played happily on the stairs. Her childhood innocence was restored. With the Andersons' permission, Ed and Lorraine told the whole story to the Ashford Gazette, omitting the most supernatural elements. They wanted the town to remember Martha Bishop and reflect on the lessons her injustice taught. As they prepared to depart, Lorraine walked the grounds one last time. In the garden, she paused by a flowering bush. A presence nearby made her turn. The ghostly apparition of a smiling young woman in colonial dress hovered. Lorraine knew at once it was Martha. "You are free now, sister," Lorraine said softly. "We cannot change the past, but your truth is known." Martha's voice whispered on the breeze. "That was all I ever wanted, to not be forgotten." Her smile grew wider as she faded away in a glow of divine light. Just then, Ed came up beside Lorraine. "We did good work here," he said proudly, pulling her close. "I think this town will heal now that the darkness has lifted." Lorraine laid her head on his shoulder, gazing up at the bright sun. "Wherever ignorance breeds fear and hatred, we'll be there to shed light on the truth. That's our calling." Hand in hand, they turned toward the house and their car waiting out front. This case was behind them, but Lorraine knew their mission would never end. She and Ed would keep fighting the shadows with faith in their hearts, wherever evil lurked. As they drove out of town, Lorraine watched in the rearview mirror as the Andersons waved goodbye from their porch. Seeing their smiling faces, she was reminded of all they fought for: life, light, and loving one another. Epilogue. In the coming decades, the Anderson house never saw another haunting. Young Lucy grew up surrounded by love and went on to have a family of her own, untroubled by the home's dark past. Around town, folks spoke kindly of the outsiders who came to Ashford and accomplished the impossible. Ed and Lorraine Warren's triumph over evil became legend, but the couple stayed humble to the end. They devoted their lives to battling the shadows, touching countless more lives. But Martha remained Lorraine's guiding light, her faith prevailing even from beyond the grave. When Lorraine left this world, she hoped to embrace Martha again in that divine light. Until then, their mission continued, dispelling hatred and fear with truth and love. The forces of darkness could haunt the shadows, but would never extinguish the light within good souls. That was the lesson of Ashford, their legacy.